She was a woman, alone, no neighbors, no supply line, and she was surrounded by men who had twice her resources and half her chances of surviving the winter. They laughed at what she was doing. By February, they were knocking on her door, not for shelter, for food. Here's why everything you think you know about winter survival is wrong. Before we talk about what she did, you need to understand what she was facing, because most people hear the word winter and picture something manageable. Cold nights, gray skies, maybe some snow on the ground. That is not what this was. This was the kind of winter where the air itself becomes a weapon. When temperatures drop far enough, exposed skin doesn't just get cold, it burns. The moisture in your breath freezes before it fully leaves your mouth. The ground locks so hard you can't drive a shovel into it. And the wind is the part no one warns you about enough. The wind doesn't just chill you, it extracts you. It pulls every degree of warmth out of every surface it touches, relentlessly, without pause. And this is where most people get it wrong. They think the danger is the cold temperature itself. It isn't. The temperature is just a number. What kills you is heat loss speed, the rate at which your body bleeds warmth into the environment around it. You can survive brutal cold if that rate is slow enough. You will die in moderate cold if that rate is fast enough. And nothing accelerates heat loss like wind-driven air over an exposed surface. Now add to that the problem of food. In deep winter, supply lines break. Preserved stores run out. The body burns dramatically more calories just to maintain temperature. You need more food at exactly the moment food becomes hardest to find. This is the trap. This is what isolated settlers faced. Not just cold, not just hunger, but both at the same time, feeding each other. The colder you are, the more you need to eat. The less you eat, the faster the cold takes you. That was what Martha Ellery was walking into, and the men around her thought they understood the problem better than she did. They were wrong. Here's where the story changes direction, because when most people in that valley started preparing for winter, they did the obvious things. They cut wood, they sealed gaps in their walls, they traded for preserved meat and dried grain. They prepared to fight the cold, to generate enough heat, store enough fuel, consume enough calories to outlast the season. Martha watched all of it, and she did something different. She planted trees. Not one, not a handful, rows of them. Deliberate, offset, curved rows placed specifically on the windward side of her cabin. The north side, the open side, the side that had nearly driven her out the previous year. But this is the part that matters. This is where she separated herself from everyone else in that valley. She didn't plant any trees. She planted fruit-bearing trees, and beneath them, root vegetables, varieties she knew could winter in the ground without rotting. Alongside them, dense berry bushes, hardy, stubborn, the kind of plants that didn't just survive cold, they required it. But wait, how does fruit survive winter? That's the question everyone asked. That's the same dismissal the men at the road gave her. Those won't last. Nothing grows in winter. You're wasting your time. If you like this story so far, there's more where that came from. Subscribe, because the next story is just as surprising. Let's continue. Here's what they didn't understand. Martha wasn't trying to grow food in winter. She was using winter itself as part of the system. Certain fruits, and the settlers who survived the longest knew this, don't just tolerate frost. They need it. The cold triggers them. It deepens sugars. It holds them on the branch or beneath the ground in a kind of suspended state, preserved by the very thing that seemed like it should destroy them. She had chosen species that produced late in the season, that held their fruit through early frost, that kept their stores both above and below ground, accessible in ways that dried grain and salted meat simply couldn't match. living food. Through the worst of it. And the windbreak wasn't separate from the food system. It was the food system. The trees slowing the wind were the same trees that would feed her. That was the design. Not two solutions. One. But this is where most people would have failed, and almost did. The first real test came in November. Not the hardest part of winter, just the opening warning, the kind of weather that revealed which preparations were real and which were wishful thinking. The wind came from the north, as it always did. Steady, persistent, the kind that didn't gust dramatically but simply pressed, hour after hour, against every surface in the valley. Temperatures dropped fast, faster than expected, and the trees were still small. This was the risk Martha had accepted when she planted them. They weren't mature, they weren't a wall. They were flexible, thin-stemmed, the kind of young growth that bent nearly horizontal in a real gust. And people saw that. They watched those saplings whipping in the wind, and they made their judgment. It isn't working. And honestly, there were moments that first November where Martha wondered the same thing. She woke before dawn on the fourth day of the wind. The fire burned low, the room cooler than she wanted it to be. She dressed quickly and stepped outside, and immediately felt what the men watching from the road couldn't feel. The difference, not absence of wind, not silence, but reduction. The force that hit her on the open side of the property, the full, unbroken press of moving Arctic air, was not what reached her walls. By the time the air had passed through 3 offset rows of planted growth, it had lost something. It had been interrupted, divided, slowed, not stopped, slowed. And in survival terms, slowed is everything. But here's what almost broke the system entirely. One of the oldest fruit trees, a crabapple she had found at the river's edge and transplanted that spring, the anchor of the food-bearing windbreak, had been hit by an early ice storm and was listing badly. The root system, not yet fully established, had begun to pull from the soil on one side. If it fell, the gap it left would funnel wind directly at the cabin's most vulnerable corner, and the ground was beginning to freeze. Martha spent the better part of 2 days in temperatures cold enough to make her hands stop working properly, driving stakes deep enough into the partially frozen earth to anchor the tree. People came to watch. Some offered advice. Most of it was some version of just let it go, plant something else in spring. She didn't let it go, not because she was stubborn, because she understood what was at stake. That tree wasn't just a windbreak. By January, its stored fruit, still clinging to the upper branches in tight clusters held by cold, preserved by frost, would be food, real food, the kind of food that carried vitamins and sugars that salted pork and dried grains simply didn't have, the kind of food that kept people thinking clearly when the cold tried to dull them. She worked until her hands were nearly useless. She saved the tree. And this is the part that most survival thinking misses entirely. The preparation that looks unnecessary in October is the thing that keeps you alive in February. January arrived like a verdict. The valley had never seen it hit quite like this. Not just cold, sustained cold. The kind where the temperature doesn't rise enough during the day to make any difference. Where everything becomes a question of endurance. Where you stop asking, will it warm up, and start asking, how long can I last? Cabins failed. Not dramatically, slowly. Fires that had to burn constantly began consuming wood supplies faster than expected. Wood supplies that seemed generous in October were running short. Men who had laughed at Martha's trees in September were burning furniture by the end of January. And here's the thing that no one talks about with extreme cold. It doesn't just take your warmth, it takes your judgment. A body that's consistently cold, not dangerously hypothermic, just constantly, persistently underheated, starts making worse decisions, starts losing the clarity needed to manage resources properly. It becomes a downward spiral. Cold leads to poor rationing leads to more cold, and eventually the spiral wins. Martha's cabin did not spiral because the windbreak was working. Not perfectly. The wind still moved, the cold still pressed, but the air that reached her walls had been interrupted enough times, broken by 3 offset rows of growth, redirected, divided, slowed, that the cabin held its warmth in a fundamentally different way. She burned half the wood her nearest neighbor burned, half, and she slept through the nights. But this is where the fruit trees become something more than a survival footnote. This is the part of the story that changes what the whole thing means. In the deepest week of January, when the cold was at its worst and the wind didn't ease for 6 days straight, Martha walked out to the tree line with a cloth bag and harvested. The crab apples were still there, frozen solid on the branch. But there, when she brought them inside and let them thaw beside the stove, they released something extraordinary. Not just calories, sweetness, tartness, the vivid, sharp flavor of living food in a season where everything else was preserved, salted, dried, or gone. She ate them slowly. She made them into a thick sauce with nothing but water and heat. She shared a small portion with Turner when he came to check on her, a man who had eaten nothing but dried meat and hard grain for 3 weeks by that point, and watched his face change when he tasted it. Not just the flavor, the recognition. This is what I've been missing, because the human body in extreme conditions doesn't just need calories, it needs the specific compounds, the sugars, the acids, the living nutrition that preserved foods can't provide. Sailors had known this for centuries. Isolated settlers learned it the hard way when they had adequate calories but still grew weak, still lost their teeth, still lost their minds. Martha hadn't just planned for warmth, she had planned for health. The root vegetables stored beneath a thick layer of mulch at the base of the windbreak, insulated by the snowdrift that had formed behind the first row of trees, protected by the reduced wind flow, were still accessible. Not easy to get to, not comfortable, but there. She brought them up in small amounts throughout the winter, turnips, parsnips, varieties that sweetened with cold rather than rotting under it. Cooked simply, combined with the fruit, supplemented her preserved stores in a way that meant she arrived at spring not depleted, but functional. Strong enough to plant again immediately. Strong enough to help others who hadn't been. When the cold finally broke, and it always breaks eventually, the valley took stock. The losses were real. Not all of them survivable. Livestock gone, supplies exhausted. Some families had left mid-winter rather than face the remaining weeks. Those who stayed were thin, worn, slower than they had been in autumn. Martha was not thin. Martha was ready for spring. Turner came to find her on the first genuinely warm morning, the kind where you could feel the sun actually doing something again, and stood for a long time looking at the windbreak. The trees had held. Some branches were damaged. One smaller shrub at the end of the second row hadn't made it, but the system had held. He looked at the gaps in the upper branches of the crabapple where fruit had been harvested, at the disturbed ground near the roots where vegetables had been pulled up through the season. "You built a food system," he said. "I built a system," Martha replied. "The food was part of it." He turned that over for a moment. "Most of us spent the whole winter trying to defend against the cold," he said. "You spent the whole winter using it." That was the line. That was the thing that settled into the valley that spring and didn't leave. The cold had been the same for everyone. The wind had been the same. The temperature had been the same. What hadn't been the same was the relationship to those conditions. Most people in that valley had treated winter as an enemy, something to hold off, fight against, survive in spite of. Martha had treated it as a system, and she had built her own system inside it. The frost that preserved her fruit, the snow that insulated her root stores, the wind that, broken and slowed by the trees, became not a destroyer but a presence she had accounted for, had used by forcing it to deposit snow in exactly the places she needed insulation. She hadn't fought the cold. She had made the cold work for her. And this is where the real lesson lives. Not in the specifics of which trees she planted or how she spaced them, though that matters, but in the fundamental shift in thinking that made all of it possible. Most survival thinking is reactive. What do I do when the cold comes? What do I do when the food runs out? What do I do when the fire dies? Martha's thinking was structural. What system can I build so that the cold coming is not a crisis, so that food running out is not a single catastrophic event, but a slow draw from multiple sources, so that the fire dying overnight is not the end of warmth, but simply a fire that needs one log to resume? The difference isn't skill. It's the question you ask before winter arrives. She asked, "How does this system behave when the worst happens?" Everyone else asked, "How do I get through tonight?" And in a place where survival depends not on one good night, but on 60 consecutive ones, on the accumulated ability to stay warm, stay fed, and stay clear-headed through weeks of unrelenting pressure, that difference decides everything. The men who had watched her plant those saplings in summer, who had shaken their heads and muttered about wasted effort and decoration, came back that spring, not to apologize, to ask how to plant their own. Because knowledge like this doesn't stay theoretical for long. When you've watched a neighbor eat well while you chewed salt-dried meat, when you've pressed your hand against a warm wall while your own was freezing, when you've stood behind a row of living trees in the worst wind of the season and felt the pressure drop around you like stepping out of current into still water, you stop asking whether it works. You start asking how to build it. That spring, the windward side of nearly every cabin in the valley was being planted, not in imitation, in understanding, because Martha hadn't discovered a trick. She had rediscovered something older than any of them, something the land itself had always been trying to show anyone patient enough to watch. That survival is not about fighting what comes at you. It's about designing what it finds when it arrives. She had done that, and the trees, bent, wind-shaped, scarred from the worst of winter, were already leafing out again, already preparing to feed her through another year, already working